Okay, so you want to buy a Formula One team. You picture it immediately, the garage, the engineers in headsets whispering into microphones like they're launching a rocket. Your name on the pit wall, two cars screaming past at 220 miles an hour with your logo stretched across the nose. Champagne on the podium, sprayed straight into your face, because apparently that's tradition now. Max Verstappen or Lewis Hamilton or whoever's driving for you, thanking you by name in the post-race interview. Billionaires in the Paddock Club nodding at you like you finally belong there. Because now technically you do. That's the dream. Here's what actually happens. First problem, you can't just build a team and show up. Formula One only allows 10 teams on the grid, and that number hasn't really moved in years. So unless one of the existing 10 decides to sell, or the sport decides to expand, you're not getting in, full stop. When Cadillac wanted in, yes, the car company backed by General Motors, it took roughly 2 years of negotiating with Formula One management and the FIA just to get an entry approved for the 2025 season. And they had to pay something in the region of $450 million just for the privilege of being allowed to compete. That's before they built a single car. So option 1 is pay a 9-figure anti-dilution fee to join as an 11th team, assuming the sport lets you. Option 2, the far more common one, is you buy an existing team. And those prices have gone absolutely insane over the last decade. Let's talk numbers. Back in 2019, on paper, most F1 teams were valued somewhere between $100 million and $500 million, depending on how competitive they were. Fast forward to today, and it's a completely different world. When Audi wanted to enter the sport, they didn't build from scratch. They bought a controlling stake in the Sauber team. And by the time the deal was fully structured, they'd committed well over $600 million just to acquire and rebrand the outfit, with billions more earmarked for the years after to make it actually competitive. Aston Martin's team, which used to be called Racing Point, is now valued at north of $1 billion by some estimates, largely because of the extraordinary investment poured in by owner Lawrence Stroll. And Williams, a team that was basically broke and finishing dead last for years, got bought by the American investment firm Doralton Capital in 2020 for about £152 million, and it's now worth several times that. So, depending on which team, entering this sport costs anywhere from $150 million for a struggling backmarker to well over $1 billion for a competitive frontrunner with a real shot at wins. And before we go further, if you're the kind of person who actually wants to understand where money hides in businesses that look glamorous on the surface, this is exactly what this channel does every single day. We take an asset everyone fantasizes about owning, and we open up the real numbers underneath it. So if that sounds like your thing, hit subscribe now because it helps sincerely more than you'd think, and it means you won't miss the next one. All right, back to the pit lane. Now here's the first trap almost nobody talks about. Buying the team is the cheap part. Formula One has something called the cost cap. It was introduced in 2021, specifically because teams like Mercedes and Ferrari were spending anywhere from $400 million to as much as $500 million a season just on car development, trying to out-engineer each other into oblivion. The cost cap now sits at around $135 million a year for car performance costs. That sounds like a rule designed to save you money. It's actually a rule that tells you the mandatory minimum table stakes just to be allowed on the grid. $135 million a year, every year, whether you finish first or dead last. And that cap doesn't even include driver salaries, marketing, or the top 3 executives' pay. Those are separate, uncapped, and can easily add another $50 to $100 million on top, depending on who you're paying. So you've spent $500 million to buy the team. Now you owe another $180 to $200 million this year, and next year, and the year after that, before you've made a single dollar back. This is the hidden trap. In Formula One, the spending starts on day one, and the revenue takes years to catch up. You're paying engineers, aerodynamicists, and factory staff. Some teams employ over 800 people every single week, regardless of whether the car is fast. You're paying for wind tunnel time, which is itself now rationed and capped based on where you finished in the championship the year before. So if you're doing badly, you actually get less tunnel time to fix it, which is its own cruel spiral. You're shipping freight, engines, chassis, spare parts, garage equipment to 24 races around the world every season, and freight alone can run into the tens of millions of dollars a year. Meanwhile, the prize money from Formula One management, the actual parent organization that runs the commercial side of the sport, doesn't get distributed until after the season based on where you finished. So for months, you're bleeding cash before a cent comes back. Sound like a nightmare? It kind of is. So how does anybody make money doing this? 2 main income streams. One obvious, one you'd never guess. The obvious one is the prize money, officially called the Column 1 payment, which comes from Formula One management's broadcasting, race hosting, and commercial revenues, all pooled together and split among the 10 teams based on championship position. This pool is worth well over $1 billion a year across the whole grid. Finish first in the Constructors' Championship and you might take home $150 to $180 million. Finish last and you're still guaranteed a baseline payment, somewhere in the range of $40 to $60 million, just for showing up and being one of the 10. It's regulated, it's predictable, and it's completely dependent on how the car performs on Sunday. The less obvious income stream, the one that actually makes this business insanely profitable if you get it right, is sponsorship and brand partnerships. This is the unregulated high-margin part. A Formula One car is basically a 400-kilometer-an-hour billboard broadcast to hundreds of millions of people across 24 countries a year. With cameras following it in close-up for 2 hours straight, companies pay enormous money for that kind of exposure. Red Bull's own team doesn't need outside sponsors in the traditional sense, because Red Bull, the energy drink company, owns the team outright. It's essentially the ultimate marketing expense for the parent brand. But look at a team like Aston Martin. Title sponsors, technical partners, and livery space deals can bring in well over $100 million a year combined. And here's the kicker. Sponsorship revenue isn't capped the way car development spending is, so a well-run team with strong commercial partnerships can be pulling in serious cash regardless of where they finish on Sunday. That's the real money machine. The racing itself is basically the world's most expensive advertisement, and the smart owners understand they're not really in the racing business, they're in the eyeballs business. Now let's talk about what happens when this goes wrong, because it goes wrong a lot. The most brutal example is probably the collapse of the original Manor team, which raced under a few different names over the years. Marussia, then Manor Racing, they entered the sport around 2010 as part of a wave of new teams promised a budget cap that never actually got enforced. So they were competing against outfits spending 10 times their budget. They went into administration in 2014, came back briefly, and then folded for good in 2017, owing creditors tens of millions of pounds. Or look at Caterham, another team from that same era, founded by Malaysian billionaire Tony Fernandes, which also collapsed into administration around the same time, having burned through well over $100 million total with almost nothing to show for it competitively. These weren't stupid people. They were experienced businessmen who understood motorsport. They just underestimated how brutal the cost structure is when you're not winning. Because in this sport, when you're not winning, you're still spending exactly the same amount on infrastructure, just with worse sponsorship checks coming in. Now, the success story, and it's an almost unbelievable one, Red Bull Racing. Red Bull entered Formula One in 2005 after buying the failing Jaguar racing team for a reported $1, plus assuming its debts, which is its own story about how desperate F1 team owners can get when a team isn't working. For years, Red Bull spent hundreds of millions without winning much of anything. Then, starting around 2010, they won 4 consecutive Constructors' Championships with Sebastian Vettel, and later an even more dominant stretch with Max Verstappen starting in 2021. Today, Red Bull Racing is estimated to be worth well over $2 billion, and in the years they've dominated, industry estimates put their operating profit after that $135 million cost cap kicked in and actually forced some financial discipline across the whole grid at well over $100 million a year. That's a business built essentially from a $1 acquisition that now throws off 9-figure annual profits. It's one of the greatest brand marketing investments in the history of sports, because remember, the whole team exists to sell energy drinks to 18-34-year-olds, and by that metric, it has worked beyond anyone's wildest projections. So what actually separates Manor and Caterham from Red Bull? A few things, and none of them are luck. First, ownership commitment and patience. Red Bull was willing to lose money for close to 6 years before the championships started coming. Most owners don't have that kind of runway or that kind of deep-pocketed parent company bankrolling them through the lean years. Second, technical talent retention. Red Bull poached one of the greatest aerodynamicists in the sport's history, Adrian Newey, and kept him for nearly 2 decades in a cost-capped world. The single biggest competitive advantage isn't money anymore. Everyone's capped at the same $135 million. It's how efficiently and cleverly you spend that exact same number compared to your rivals. Talent matters more now than it ever has, precisely because raw spending power matters less. Third, brand independence from race results. Teams that built sponsorship relationships around genuine long-term brand storytelling, rather than just "we might win so pay us," survive the bad seasons. Teams that only attracted sponsors during winning streaks watched those same sponsors evaporate the moment results dipped, which is exactly what happened to several backmarker teams throughout the 2010s. And fourth, and this one's boring, but it matters enormously, cash flow discipline around the payment calendar. Since prize money comes in based on the previous year's championship position and gets paid out across the following season, teams that finish poorly get squeezed hardest exactly when they need money most to fund the fixes for next year's car. It's a vicious cycle that has bankrupted more than one small team, and it's a big part of why so few of the original grid from 20 years ago still exist under the same ownership. So where's this all heading? Formula One today is a completely different financial animal than it was 15 years ago. Liberty Media, the American company that bought the commercial rights to F1 from previous owner Bernie Ecclestone back in 2017 for about $8 billion, has spent years turning the sport into a proper entertainment product. Most visibly through the Netflix series Drive to Survive, which is widely credited with massively expanding the sport's audience in the United States specifically. That expansion is exactly why Cadillac and General Motors wanted in badly enough to pay that $450 million entry fee. America has become the growth market, with races now in Miami, Austin, and Las Vegas alone reportedly generated well over $500 million in economic impact for the city in its debut year. The broader trend is towards higher franchise values, stricter cost discipline through the cap, and teams behaving less like scrappy racing outfits and more like professionally run sports franchises, similar to what you'd see in the NFL or the Premier League, where media rights and entertainment value matter as much as, or more than, the sport itself. There's also a slow but real shift happening around driver economics, which almost nobody outside the paddock talks about. Drivers used to be paid mostly to drive fast. Now, the biggest names, Hamilton, Verstappen, and a handful of others, are increasingly paid as much for their personal brand and social following as for lap times, because teams have realized a driver with 50 million followers moves sponsorship needles almost as much as a driver who wins races. That's changing how owners build their rosters, and it's starting to blur the line between a race team and a media production company with a very expensive hobby on the side. So should you actually try to buy a Formula One team? Here's the honest two-scenario answer. Optimistic scenario, you buy a mid-tier team for somewhere around $300 to $500 million. You retain strong technical leadership, you invest patiently for 4 to 6 years without panicking, you build a sponsorship portfolio that isn't purely dependent on race results. And eventually you climb into that top half prize money bracket while your brand partnerships mature alongside the sport's growing global audience. Within a decade, your team could be worth well over $1 billion. And depending on your commercial deals, you might be running an operating profit in the tens of millions annually on top of that asset appreciation. That's essentially the Aston Martin and Williams trajectory right now. Not champions yet, but valuations climbing fast and the underlying business fundamentals improving every single year. Realistic scenario, you buy a backmarker team, underestimate how brutal the cost cap floor really is. Watch your sponsors get nervous after 2 bad seasons and find yourself either selling at a loss within 5 years or worse, going into administration the way Manor and Caterham did. Somewhere around half of the teams that have entered Formula One over the last 25 years no longer exist in their original form. They were sold, rebranded, or folded outright. The sport is genuinely Darwinian, and the cost cap, while it's made the racing itself more competitive on track, has made survival for undercapitalized owners even harder off it. Because now you can't simply outspend your way out of a bad situation. You have to be good, not just rich, and that's a much smaller club to belong to. Because here's the truth. Underneath all of this, you're not really buying a race team, you're buying an extremely expensive, globally broadcast marketing and technology company that happens to go racing on Sundays, and whether it makes you money depends entirely on whether you understand that distinction before you sign the check, not after. You're not buying speed, you're buying a business that races for its living, and only the ones that treat it like a business first ever actually win anything at all.